Good evening, Lwazi. How are you?
Good afternoon, Ali. It's a very, very beautiful day in Port Elizabeth, but we meet in very treacherous times, times of COVID-19, times of isolation, times of hardships. But now we are meeting together on this virtual platform to discuss truth to power and the truth about what is happening in our continent and in our international system. So I'm glad to be here with the great Africa for Palestine. For many years, Africa for Palestine has fought for human rights within the continent and within in the international system. And I'm glad to be sharing this platform with the comrades at Africa for Palestine to speak truth to power.
Thanks, Lwazi, for accepting our invitation. It's been long in the pipelines for our audience. They've been trying to get Lwazi on one of the live webinars. We have him already, and we are quite excited to have this session as well as a very, very good session, very informative session, a very contradictory session, and we hope that you enjoy it, and we hope that you take some important discussions from this. For those who are not familiar with us, we are Africa for Palestine. We are a human rights solidarity organization based in South Africa that does work in the African continent and abroad. Our work is particularly preoccupied with Palestinian rights and raising Palestinian awareness in the continent, and was especially driving out Israeli influence in the African continent. We work with several other organizations, NGOs, NPOs, faith-based organizations, churches, mosques, and so on. We're also working with broader civil society organizations, your trade union movement, your political parties, and even governments in the African continent that identify with our cause. We have started this webinar series. We are 2 months in now, where we invite different people from different walks of life to talk about different things. And today we have Comrade Lwazi Somya, who will be talking about Israel's desperate influence in the African continent. Lwazi is a long-time supporting volunteer for Africa of Palestine in the broader Palestine solidarity movement. So Lwazi, let's get into it. To our audience and to those who follow these webinar sessions, just briefly tell us who is Lwazi Somya?
So I'm with Lwazi Somya. I'm a township ruralitarian from the Eastern Cape of Epai, KwaZulu. The former vice president of the University of Cape Town, SRC. I have 2 degrees in international relations from the University of Cape Town. Currently a Chevening scholar at the University of Bristol, studying in international relations, majoring in diplomacy. And currently working with the Southern African Liaison Office, dealing with issues of human rights, peace and security, and women's and protection of the LGBTI community, along with many other issues of peace and security around the continent and across the world. So this is part of my studies, and part of my passions is to speaking truth and to desensitize academia from its sanitization of the situation in Palestine, and in particular the human rights atrocities carried out by Israel. But now for today's talk, we are here to talk about the African continent and Israel's desperate attempts to influence the African continent by all means necessary. So I'm glad to be on this platform, and I'm glad to be engaging with comrades from Africa for Palestine on this matter.
Thank you. What we know now is we won't be thumb sucking in this session. You are quite accomplished scholar in the field. Lwazi, we know that the state of Israel was established in 1948 after a brutal war on Palestinians and what we call the Nakba. Just tell us that historical, and this is quite a young nation state. When from 1948 till now, it's a young nation state. Just briefly walk us through the history of, since the establishment of Israel in 1948, what has been the relationship with Africa since then until the recent past?
So outside of in common Israeli propaganda of the notion of Israel as a state itself being more than 1,000 years old. It's a very recent ideological perspective that there needs to be a creation of a Jewish state named Israel. In fact, we can really trace down the ideas to the leaders of the Zionist movement through Theodor Herzl and them. But at the time, before 1948, what they were considering to be Israel was not what is currently where Israel is. So they were given three options. One of them being Argentina. We all know who went to Argentina after the end of the World War II. And then there was an option of Uganda, where the League of Nations and the Western powers wanted to implement a settled state, a settlement within the African continent for European Jewish refugees to settle in. So there will be another settler colonial state implemented in Africa. But now they eventually ended up settling on Palestine and Palestinian land. Now, the entire notion that there should be a Jewish state on what is currently known as Jerusalem, what is currently known as the West Bank, and what is currently known as occupied territories is a fairly new conceptualization that has over time moved on to become the realization and the fantasies of the West. And this is why, as soon as the creation of the state of Israel happened, a war broke out. The reason why war broke out was because through the creation of the state of Israel, the agreements were that people would live side by side together. But the creation of the state of Israel, with this determination of it being a Jewish state, consequently it resulted in them having to push out anyone else who was not in line with that national identity. So what has happened is that Israel, since its inception, has often, in fact, all the time, ethnically cleansed the region in order to fulfill the initial Jewish state prophecy that they had. Even though it's premised on wrong, for some Christians, it's based on Bible prophecies. For some, but morally, and politically, it was based on a political decision that was made in a boardroom by the political elite of the West, and there was not necessarily a consensus or a natural urge of the people of the region to have a state of Israel formed. So you understand that in 1948, it was around the end of the World War. South Africa itself has implemented, as the National Party has taken its reins, and the state of Israel is created. But the first country to recognize Israel as a state is the apartheid state of South Africa. And that happens in 1949. So the apartheid state of South Africa, fully knowing that they're going to displace Black people within South Africa, fully knowing they're going to commit ethnic cleansing and push Black people into Bantustans, and to push people into areas where they're going to create mini concentration camps for Black existence. That is why the South African government was the first state to acknowledge that, because they knew the agenda Israel was setting in the region was the agenda that we're setting here in Southern Africa. And this is why the entire notion of apartheid itself becomes a conceptualization of a settler colonial construct. Apartheid itself was a consolidation of the settler colonial project, at which the white inhabitants of South Africa consolidated the settler colonial project. Similar to Israel, what they're currently doing is that they've consolidated the settler colonial project, and they're expanding into settlements and impeding on Palestinian territory, ethnically cleansing Palestinian people, brutalizing people, and displacing them for over generations. So after South Africa in 1956, Ghana officially recognized, and this had a snowball effect. So by 1973, Israel was recognized by 33 countries within the African continent. Remember, there are more than 33 countries in the African continent. Many of them still stood on principle. South Africa was one of the countries that had always sided with the apartheid regime of Israel, because they shared similar ideological leniencies. So the October War happened in 1973, and virtually all African states broke relations with Israel. So except for 4 countries, it was South Africa, Malawi, Lesotho, and Swaziland, right? Both of them are under the influence of South Africa. The apartheid regime is sphere of influence at the time. So they continued having these relationships. June 16, 1976, Ihipo that was there, the military vehicles that were there, and even during Christmas 4, the military vehicles were there. They're all part of the Israeli military construct. We were the state at the time bought it from and procured arms from Israel. So Israel comes into Africa as this we shall support a particular idea, because at the time you must realize South Africa was aligned to a certain political force within the global paradigm. So they're not aligned to the rest of the African continent, and South Africa itself was essentially a destabilizing figure within the continent. So in 1975, what is amazing is that in 1975 there was an assembly of the Organization of African Unity in Kampala. The 12th ordinary session adopted 3 resolutions on the situation in Palestine. Right. The resolution 73 was on Afro-Arab cooperation. Was clearly at the African continent had taken a side in the conflict and said that they were going against the colonizer and siding with the colonized. They were going against the powerful, and they were siding with the meek. The resolution 76, which talked about the Middle East and occupied territories. This one talked about the withdrawal of Israel from occupied territories. So imagine in 2020, we're still launching resolutions in the United States Security Council on the withdrawal of Israel from occupied Palestinian territories. So all these years, we have not made any advances on the basis that Israel's position in the world order has been sustained by an unjust global political system, which is dominantly led by America at this current time. We'll talk about America's influence in Africa and how Israel has benefited from that a bit later. And resolution number 77 too, which essentially criminalizes, essentially states that Zionism itself, the political ideology of Zionism, is a racist, xenophobic ideology that seeks to perpetuate human rights atrocities within Palestine. So the African Union in 1975 already was pretty clear about the situation. And Israel itself was made a pariah by the African states and the global South. But where did things change? Um, um, so you realize that in the early 90s, the Oslo Accords happened, and that's when Israel started and America started through previous Republican presidents, through a Democratic president, Bill Clinton itself. That's when Israel started subtly making its claws, taking its claws back into the African continent, using our poverty from post-colonial strife, through sanctions, through wars that we've enjoyed as Africans, in order for them to infiltrate the African continent and to influence African states. And we'll talk about how the Israel itself has used our deficiencies to benefit its foreign policy goals and to legitimize its hold on to the African continent.
Interestingly, speaking about the Organization of African Unity, which which was success by the African Union. Of course, it was established by giants of our liberation movements, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Muammar Gaddafi was one of them as well. Oliver Tambo was not a state president, but they were instrumental in forming this pan-Africanist type of body. Now, we know that Palestine, through the Palestine Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat, was given an observer status in the Organization of African Unity. They still have an observer status in the African Union through Abbas, the president of Palestine. We know that they have an observer status in the Pan-Africanist Pan-Africanist Parliament. They still have, so there's that long history of solidarity with Black African liberation leaders, Black African liberation movements with Palestine. Now, we know that Israel is trying to do the same. Israel is trying to get an observer status in the AU, and they are using their proxy countries that they have quasi relations with to push this particular narrative. Would you please let us know of how did that process unfold? How far is it going, and where do you see it going at this current rate?
So we have multiple countries within the AU that we know that are perpetually indebted to Israel. Not necessarily because they they have any ideological leanings towards Israel, because in a particular time it suits their own foreign policy needs. So, for example, when we look at Togo, and how they failed to organize the Afro-Israeli conference, it truly speaks about the history of how the mechanization of Israel's foreign policy eventually builds up to creating these relationships, and eventually fails due to the fact that grassroots citizens are rejecting the apartheid state of Israel. So, for example, um, Togo in 2017 attempted to organize this summit under oh yeah, Togo becomes the only African country to vote against the resolution condemning Donald Trump's expansion into Israel, into Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Right, that was the only African country. Right, so, and in the same year, they tried to organize an Africa-Israeli summit, which also failed due to protests on the streets. Faure Gnassingbe was installed by the army in 2005, following the death of his father, who himself was installed by a coup in 1967, faced a situation of a crisis of legitimacy. Facing that crisis of legitimacy, Togo needed some form of economic stimulus package. So in 2016, Togo got around 13.5 million US dollars, which was a major economic boost to the country's economy, compared to 2019, where Togo still sides with Israel, where they currently get around 24.9 million US dollars in terms of military aid, whilst they're abusing committing human rights atrocities. They killed 6 protesters in the last protest, and they perpetually go against what America and the West continue to say they allocate their funds and funding towards, right? So why are the West so interested in investing in Togo? It's because they're trying to bolster Israel as a state. For example, Israel as a state itself relies so much of what we call clout due to America's foreign aid and foreign policy on African states. The United States has leveraged its free trade agreements due to and leveraged its economy in order to benefit the State of Israel. The COVID-19 pandemic itself has presented further economic pressures on countries, and has presented further economic constraints on countries, resulting in them seeking alternatives, even if backing out on the human rights-based approach towards the international system. So for Togo itself, for countries like Togo, for them is to sustaining a regime and to pacify resistance from the ground in order to perpetuate the regime's hold on to power. But for other states, it is a means to escaping the economic crises and the perpetual poverty that they seek. Because even though, for example, Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta does not necessarily face a crisis of legitimacy in terms of electoral balloting, but Judy faces a crisis when it comes to his relations with the international community. So Donald Trump, Barack Obama invested heavily in Kenya, and due to wanting to influence Kenya, because Barack Obama saw that South Africa itself is a non-viable means to gaining access into Africa. So they sought other alternatives for Israeli influence. So they moved on to Kenya, which is an upgrade. It has good financial institutions. It is a good platform to influence regional politics, and it is a good platform to do what American plans to do in terms of influencing America's course when it comes to the West and how it approaches Israel itself. So for Kenya, it is a means to leaving the economic constraints of the COVID-19 economic crisis, because that's why America used the free trade agreement as a carrot and whip in order for them to recognize Israel as a legitimate state, in order for them to ban the BDS movement, in order for them to depoliticize its relations with Israel, in order for them to in order for them to accompany Israelis' foreign policy needs. So we are under siege, right? But they are failing. They've historically failed and they continue to perpetually fail. the conference, the summit, the economic summit in Togo, for example, is a common failure of Israel due to the mere fact that grassroots support for the cause of Palestine has been far greater than that of the political elite in each country. And you see,
interesting that you sorry to cut in. Interesting that you do raise the issue of Kenya, and I know that we're going to speak about a number of countries as well. That basically what's happening in Kenya is that the United States says, all right, we are going to continue this free trade agreement only if you normalize relations with Israel. We see that even in Togo itself, like you were saying, they get the stimulus packages from the United States, the military aid from Israel. We see a pattern of economic blackmail, where the United States is blackmailing African leaders into normalizing relations with Israel. As we move forward, of course, I just wanted to cut in and raise this, that the new interim government of Sudan after al-Bashir was taken out, the United States has said to Sudan, look, guys, if you normalize relations with Israel, of which they've severed ties for decades now, if you normalize relations with Israel, are going to remove Sudan from the terrorist list, which means trade opportunities will open up, aid opportunities will open up. So there's this pattern of economic blackmail more than anything. And I think we should not perhaps paint all African leaders who would particularly side with Israel as sellouts, but others are just really forced into a corner by the United States and Israel to do as the powers that be, please. So just as we go on, the Sudan issue is important as well.
So there are two situations in Sudan, right? So in 2016, the Sudanese minister Ibrahim Gabur, who was a minister of foreign affairs at the time, suggested that they were willing to normalize ties with Israel on the provision that sanctions were lifted by the USA. So Omar Bashir at the time was facing so much, and Sudan itself was facing so much economic pressure. They were willing to normalize relations with Israel in order to relieve some of that, and to also remove liability or accountability from Obama al-Bashir. So their plan, Obama al-Bashir's executive at the time, their plan was that, okay, we can escape being held accountable by the international community by accepting Israel as and normalizing ties with Israel. But now what has happened is that the Sudanese transition government of Sudan is facing a lot of pressure to succeed because they are an interim government. And whilst they're facing so much pressure as an interim government to normalize relations with Israel, in fact, this year alone, right, in February, Benjamin Netanyahu met with the Sovereign Council of Sudan, Abdel Fattah al-Bahrain, and they met in Uganda earlier this year in February, right, in 2020, in January of 2020. No, in February 2020. Later on in the month, in February 2020, Israeli planes were allowed to fly over Sudan. And this process, and so so people must not be surprised if Sudan is the next signatory to Donald Trump's scam in the Middle East. So we must continue putting pressure on African countries because Sudan has already started this process. Because why? They are under economic constraints. The new sovereign government, the sovereign interim council, seeks legitimacy from the international community, and the people who are willing to provide the legitimacy are the people who are willing to pay for the aid. So what does Sudan need the most at the current moment? It's aid. So once that aid is provided, Sudan thinks that it will be able to go on upfront economically, but that's not the case. Sudan will be used nothing more as a pawn to legitimize Israel in the international community, similar to what Israel has done to Togo in the international community. When you ask diplomats from Togo why they vote with Israel, their only response is that Israel needs a friend in the international community and nothing else. Nothing based on human rights and the human rights atrocities are carried out by Israel. Nothing concerning the expansion of settlements by Israel. Nothing concerning the exponential bombings of the Gaza Strip. Nothing concerning the dispossession of people and the migrant population and the external of Palestine, in Lebanon and Syria and all other places of the world, except for in Palestine. So when we look at the situation in Africa, so there will be two kinds of siders of Israel. Ones who are solely seeking to legitimize their authoritarian regime, and ones who are seeking shelter by the US through the USA to keep their hold on to power by siding with Israel, and then ensuring that their hold on to power is kept, whether it means perpetually brutalizing their own citizens. And we'll get to the situation of Zimbabwe and the warning about Zimbabwe a bit later. And the others who are facing economic hardships that are now forced to go and seek bread or shelter or economic assistance from the USA, resulting in the USA pushing them towards closer to Israel. So none of this is ideologically, fundamentally, or based in human rights or on truth. It is all based on political calculations made by political elites at a certain time. And this is all at the expense of civilian Palestinian population and civilian migrant population within Israel. Because we must also realize that Israeli apartheid does not necessarily affect solely Palestinians. There are African Jews within Israel. In fact, the Ethiopian Jews, if you follow the National Geographic Genome Study, Ethiopian Jews are the original Jews that were there around the time of Jesus. So genetically, the African Jews that they're brutalizing are the most related to the original Jews that they claim to represent. So now, when you look at the situation where Israel continues and perpetually brutalizes Ethiopian Jews itself, you realize that the state of Israel is not really a Jewish state. Because their ultimate goal, if they were seeking to have a solid Jewish state, they'll be willing to accept the African Jews from Ethiopia and sustain them and not brutalize them. But what they do, they are a racist, xenophobic Israeli apartheid state on the basis that they are seeking a certain type of Jew that they want to be part of the statehood, a notion of statehood. And they're looking at a certain type of person who's aligned to the Zionist tropes that are continuing to perpetuate the human rights atrocities and the bombardments of Palestinians and the ethnic cleansing in the region. So if you're looking at it from a continental perspective, so you always have to look at the political elites that are gunning to protect their own space and legitimacy through brushing and stroking the ego of the USA and Israel, and the others who are in a desperate situation that are being forced through free trade agreements and other multilateral institutions and agreements and conventions to side with Israel, even against their will. Whilst the populations of Africa continue to fight against Israel's colonialism, because we understand the plight of colonialism, we understand apartheid itself as a construct, and we understand the notions of ethnic genocide, because that has been our reality for centuries. The 150-year wars of dispossession of Africans are exactly what the Palestinians are experiencing currently. When the Khoi and Sons were obliterated by the settler colonialists, that is exactly what the Palestinians are experiencing. When British soldiers went and attacked the Eastern Cape and the northern areas of this country, we must know that this is what the Palestinians are currently experiencing. But now we try to sensitize it and sanitize it under the guise of this liberal peace paradigm of this international system, and see, no, there's a peace process going on, there's mediation going on, whilst we ignore the vagrant human rights atrocities being carried out on the ground. And that is the trouble with the international system. We've become too desensitized to human atrocity and to human crisis.
Yeah. You mentioned that Togo is a certain type of country, and then you said we'll go to Zimbabwe as well. But I want us to go to Zimbabwe, and let's go to Rwanda as well, because these are the countries that I know recently Zimbabwe has been trying to have a relationship a more conducive relationship with Israel, of course, which, by the way, Zimbabwean citizens on the ground are protesting against. The government cannot normalize relations with Israel. We know that also Zimbabwe is trying to get security, and this is quite funny, security kind of assistance from Israel. We know that Israel uses their military and the military police to oppress Palestinians, and this is what the Zimbabwean government wants to enforce in their country. We know this in Rwanda as well, Rwanda, where Israel wanted to, in their racist endeavor, to ship out all African asylum seekers to Rwanda. They tried to bribe Rwanda to just, as you let us in on Zimbabwe and Rwanda as well. Also, please highlight more on the kind of leaders and the kind of governments Israel wants to be in alliance with. We know for a fact that countries like South Africa, the post-democracy South Africa, we know countries like Senegal, countries like Zambia and Namibia, they're a no-go area for Israel because number one, they're democratic states, number two, they're legitimate states, number three, they're progressive states. And Israel does not want to form an alliance with those type of states, but it's looking for a certain type of government, a certain type of authority to have an alliance with. So as you let us know what's happening in Zimbabwe, what's happening in Rwanda, can you just let us in on that as well, the type of alliance Israel wants to have?
So when you look at the history of Zimbabwe, since liberation, Zimbabwe has been principled on the situation of Israel-Palestine since its independence, right? For example, in 1983, before Robert Mugabe launched his genocidal campaign in Matabeleland, the former Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, Abel Muzorewa, went to Israel, right? And in his excursion to Israel, he went and said that the Zimbabwean government. Let me read this, right? The Zimbabwean government must take advantage of Israel's agricultural and technological industries, as Mugabe's policies against Israel were harming those different sectors, right? Later on that year, Muzorewa returned to Zimbabwe and was arrested. In his arrest, he was imprisoned that year for conspiracy with Israel and South Africa. So Zimbabwe at that time had a staunch position that we do not collaborate with an apartheid state, and we do not collaborate with an illegitimate state that continues to perpetuate colonial and systematic violence on the natives of that land. But those contradictions were thrown stark wide when Mugabe went and attacked the Bede people in Operation Kukuruhundi. So Mugabe was toppled in 2017, and Emerson Mnangagwa took the helm. Now, Emerson Mnangagwa himself, he tried to portray this thing of Zimbabwe is opening for business, while he continued to brutalize the citizenry. In fact, in the previous elections in 2018, 6 civilians were killed, whilst he utilized state armed forces to further and perpetuate what Mugabe did to his citizens during his tenure. And so Emerson Mnangagwa himself continued on the line of state brutality, as Mnangagwa as Mugabe had done. So the COVID-19 pandemic hits. Zimbabwe's economic fortunes continue to plunder. Prospects of economic recovery continue to go down, and an El Nino heat wave as a result of climate change decimates the agricultural sector in Zimbabwe, and the lack of infrastructure in the financial institutions further dilapidate the economy and further does not link to the investment drive Mnangagwa has been driving for. So what does he do? You're facing a crisis of legitimacy within your country because the economy is failing. People are on the streets, they're protesting. So in August this year, Mnangagwa appointed an Israeli national called Ronnie Levy Musan, and he made him the honorary consul of Zimbabwe to Israel. And in September this month, Ronnie comes back and said he has engaged with the the Israeli government, and they want to deploy security experts in Zimbabwe to train the military, the police, and the intelligence services on containing civilian disobedience. So Israel now plays a role as the funder of crackdowns and the funder of authoritarian regimes, similar to how they played that role during apartheid in South Africa. You must realize that the arms that were used to repress our people during apartheid in South Africa, some of them came from Israel. And the arms that we use now, the arms that are going to be used to further suppress the people of Zimbabwe come from Israel. The international community sits back and waits and watches as Israel continues to arm African regimes to brutalize their citizens, because those African political leaders are facing serious questions of legitimacy. So Israel looks at a particular category of African leaders, those who are facing a crisis of legitimacy, those who are under economic constraints, and those who are facing civilian dissent and launches and lending hand. Where it failed is in South Africa, when Cape Town had that day zero situation, and Israel wanted to in soft power approach, put in desalination plants into Cape Town. Fortunately, day zero is now gone, and the Cape Town dams are 95% today as we count. But Israel's attempts within the continent of using American money board technology to further influence African states within the continent is nothing new. So you'd find that due to issues of climate change, Israel is now gonna has this entire technological drive of saying that we're able to plant in semi-arid desert lands. We should forget about the atrocities we're committing on Palestinians. But look at these olive trees we managed to plant in the middle of the desert. Or they was able to say that due to the mere fact that the economy is collapsing, Israel was able to bolster the agricultural sector. But look at what we're able to do in the desert, because why? They fully know our weaknesses as African state, because of the challenges that we have on our economy, political leadership, and the issues of climate, and issues of poverty and employment, and the multiple issues of inequality that exist within our continent that we need to sort out as Africans ourselves. But Israel leverages on that in order to seek legitimacy, and for us as an international community to close our eyes to the human rights atrocities. So when we look at a broader international system, Israel places itself at a very interesting positionality. It places itself as a tool of the West to assert its global economic and global political influence in the entire world. For example, the USA during Barack Obama, before Barack Obama left the White House, right? Israel, he contributed the most aid by any US president to the Palestinian cause, right? Everyone clapped. What was not mentioned in the media is that in the same afternoon, Barack Obama contributed the largest defense budget and defense aid budget towards Israel, which is around 170 times larger than the aid budget for Palestinians. So Israel got guns, rockets, missiles, planes, spying equipment, and everything to bolster the repression of Palestinians, whilst Palestinians were given a small amount of money just to survive. And the entire international system itself leads us to believe one thing: since the USA itself is in this battle with Russia, China, concerning the current global paradigm, we need to look at Israel itself along those lines. So and how Israel itself has and how Israel has become a pawn for American empire to continue expanding and influencing. For example, like in Rwanda. So in 1962, ties were established with Rwanda, for example, right? And Israel propped up the Houthi regime at the time. Between 1963 and 1973, Israel has established building up and bolstering the Kiyabanda regime. Instead of supporting the Tutsi refugees, all right, Israel pushed Rwanda to support Israel fully, like and the Hutu government at the time were capacitated to carry out the atrocities that happened in the early 90s and in the lead up to 1973. Obviously, the October Wars, official ties were cut, but um, they still sustained relations with the belligerent government. But last year, Israel opened its first embassy in Rwanda. Um, so, in part of the creation of that embassy, what is weird is that they wanted to ship over the African immigrants to Rwanda, right? So you realize that the entire instability within Africa was primarily caused by Western influence and how the West itself destabilized governments in Africa. And it created a refugee crisis that led to outspilling to Europe and now people seeking a shelter from Western created chaos domestically. So now Israel was wanting, through the establishment of the relations to Rwanda, fully knowing that Rwanda itself needs further investments and further infrastructure development, Israel itself offered to ship the migrants back to Rwanda, which was really weird in terms of foreign policy and in terms of migration policy in the international system, which is and how Israel itself seeks to further perpetuate how it was created in the beginning by plowing people into and hopefully displacing people already there. So when we look at Israel's influence within Africa, we was always looked at as a disruptive influence. And what we need to be careful about is how our governments and the political elite approach Israel. Because some may seek to perpetuate and keep their hold onto government while supporting Israel in its atrocities, whilst others solely seek to stand on policy and principle. So when we look at the international system as a whole, we always need to look at it in terms of the global power relations and how the global power relation people are attempting to insert themselves in an anarchic system. Realist theorists simply state that states will perpetually do what is in their self-interest. And realist theorists will even derive that argument towards the individual level. So dictators themselves are more likely to align with Israel because they see a self-interest benefit to that relationship. Those who are facing crisis of legitimacy will see a self-interest benefit to their relationship with Israel and not necessarily see the moral consequences of their self-interest. They'll not necessarily see the perpetuation of violence through their support of Israel. They will no longer see how the international system itself is in support of an ethnic cleansing of an individual native population that has historically been there for thousands of years. But now, due to the fact that I'm facing a crisis of legitimacy at home, I'm willing to support an apartheid regime. I'm willing to support an apartheid regime that is willing to perpetuate human rights atrocities, solely on the fact that I want to stay in government. So those are the issues that we as Africans need to deal with our political elite. So we must be very wary and cautious of when we elect leadership, on what basis and moral integrity did they hold. Even those who are historically regarded as revolutionary organizations are very susceptible. Look at the situation in Zimbabwe itself. ZANU-PF historically has fought against Israel, but look at now. They're seeking allyship and they have an honorary consul who is an Israeli citizen in Israel. So we have to look at how the changing balance of forces further perpetuate and now change African politics and the way we as Africans relate with each other and the international community. So we must be very wary as citizens. But Israel is not winning them. There are many countries who are fighting the good fight. South Africa has cut political ties with Israel. Senegal, Namibia have maintained their moral backbone. So the issue here is issue of moral integrity for us as Africans and moral consistency. We cannot argue against colonialism within our continent while supporting colonialism elsewhere. We cannot argue against slavery within our continent while supporting slavery elsewhere. And in our endeavors, we should always seek to divorce ourselves from the toxic colonial past ourselves and get rid of the settler colonial structures and the settler colonial institutions that bind us and oppress people throughout the entire international system. So when we look at how Israel's failed attempts at further influencing Africa, we should just look at the previous United Nations Security Council General Assembly vote on the issue of Israel and Palestine. There's a vast consensus of African states that say that Israel is a settler colonial state and they should do away with the occupation of Palestinian lands. There's a vast consensus, not only by the international community, that a truthful resolution only lies in a legitimate Palestinian state with a sovereign and free to determine their future. Because ultimately, we as Africans, we have solely fought for many centuries for our independence and our right for self-determination. We should continue fighting for the right to self-determination and the right for prosperity for others in the international system. Because that's what Palestinians did, even during their time, even during Israeli apartheid. They supported the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. They supported the liberation movements in Southern Africa. They supported the Cubans. They supported all the oppressed peoples of the world, even though they themselves were oppressed. So when we look at the situation in Palestine, we should not only look at our own individual suffering and poverty, we should also look at what the suffering and poverty of the international community, because we at the end of the world are all interlinked as human beings. Was Black people, even see it in the Black Lives Matter protests, where international solidarity itself extends beyond just the police slayings of Black people in America, because the Black people understand that what is happening in America, where the police, the military-industrial complex has manifested within the police itself, and it has militarized the police to such an extent that it has resulted in the mass execution of Black people. They fully know that the struggle of Palestinians is extremely linked to that cause, where big capital, the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, the arms manufacturing companies all play a role in the repression of people and the mass genocide of people. So our struggles throughout the international systems are interlinked. And we should always keep that in mind, that our struggles are interlinked because the international system is globalized. The notion of globalization itself has created a transnational solidarity movement, and the transnational solidarity movement is extremely aligned to the fight against transnational capitalism itself. Comrade Lenin warned about international imperialism and the international and the problems of international capitalism and its predatory nature. We should also warn against the predatory nature of international support of a settler colonial state. We should also warn against Zionism itself. Yeah.
Lwazi, just before we wrap up, there are new developments, of course, in the African continent. The monarchs of the United Arab Emirates will try to force Mauritania to normalize relations with Israel. We know the problematic monarch, again, government of Morocco, which is oppressing and it's colonizing and it's occupying Western Sahara, that they might normalize relations. And in this particular situation, interesting enough, in Morocco, it is the citizens of Morocco who, I think last week, if not week before last, went onto the street to protest against what would the actions of the government in the future that don't normalize the relations. Similar to Mauritania, which are hush reports that the UAE will force them. We are now seeing a trend where people on the ground, and this we're going to see again in Sudan, people on the ground will protest against their government decision, especially on the question of Israel. And it's interesting, we've seen protests in Tunisia against normalization. We've seen protests in Algeria where citizens are saying, no, normalization is a step in the back. Arab countries in the main in Africa. Do you think that this new kind of organization by grassroots level, by civil society organizations just like Africa for Palestine, you see them as being effective against this particular unprogressive governments?
So for the people of the world are the solution for this issue. We cannot trust our political elites anymore. We cannot trust our governments anymore to continue fighting for the people of Palestine. It is up to us as the international community and as individual citizens to mobilize and strive for the liberation of Palestinians. Because why? As I stated earlier on, the political elite are also susceptible for their own stay in government. They're also susceptible by patronage. They're also susceptible to bribery. They're also susceptible to other issues, and they're also susceptible to a crisis of legitimacy. Now, an even more important crisis of legitimacy is when you lose ground support. And it is up to us to put pressure on our political elites on that. For example, in South Africa, Africa for Palestine, along with other organizations, organized over 50,000 people to march to parliament. The outcomes of that resulted in South Africa taking a more progressive policy on Palestine. No African state currently has withdrawn its ambassador to Palestine, and on a more concerted and long-term effort. It is not by the mere grace of the political leadership gaining consciousness that they now realize that we need to cut political ties. It was the grassroots activism of many people, the grassroots lobbying of many people to make the political elite realize the injustice of the situation, and the injustices carried out by Israel on Palestinians. Now, when we look at Mauritania and the United Arab Emirates and in their attempts to influence other countries into accepting and legitimizing Israel itself as a country, it all plays a part of the entire global battle for influence and the notion of expansion of empire, of Western empire. We need to challenge the global expansionists, and especially the influence of Western elites, in particular the America and the influence on Middle Eastern and African states and how they relate with Israel itself. Because on many instances, they will use your stomachs as a tool towards oppressing Palestinians. They will use your abject poverty as a means to continue oppressing Palestinians due to the fact that they will side you with Israel in order to legitimize an illegitimate situation. So we must not be desensitized to the injustices created by Israel. We must not be desensitized to the human rights atrocities due to the mere fact that we are also under abject poverty. We must always focus and put pressure on the political elite in order for us to get a just solution for Palestinians and the oppressed peoples in the world.
Lwazi, thank you very much for this discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it as well. I think it's extremely informative. And what I can take from this as well is to encourage our brothers and sisters in the African continent to go to their civil society organizations, to their churches, to go to their organizations that they are part of, and mobilize against Israeli influence in their particular countries. Because we know it for a fact Israel is not going to stop with Rwanda, it's not going to stop with Zimbabwe, it's not going to stop with Togo. They will try like a cancerous disease to infiltrate the entire continent. So the audience out there, please organize in your own communities at grassroots level against this. Thank you again, Lwazi, for joining us. Lwazi is on Facebook. Lwazi Somya, that's his name on Facebook. He's very active on Twitter at Lwazi Somya. You can send your questions to him, because no, this was a heated discussion, and those who have follow-up questions, please do send him tweets or DMs on Twitter about his views and what we discussed in this particular webinar. This video will remain under the videos tab on our Facebook, and another video will be uploaded to YouTube, this same live feed. So you can use it for future reference. I don't know if they can use this for the academic studies, Lwazi. But you feel free to use it. It's free for all. Thank you, Lwazi, for being with us today, and good luck with your endeavors in the UK.
And another thing, I would like to encourage everyone in your day-to-day lives, wake up, continue agitating, continue fighting for justice, continue fighting for human rights. And until Palestine is free, none of us are free. Aluta continua, free, fair Palestine.
Mandla.